Hello everybody, I'm Kate Cass, and welcome to an edition of Let's Talk About. Today, let's talk about Wonka. Yep, I watched Wonka. A few people I know said I'd like it, and yeah, they were right. I like this movie. I liked it a lot. I enjoyed the characters, the performances, the production, the music, and even some subtle theming I saw throughout. It's gonna be one of those movies that I can go on about for a while if you'll let me. But fear not for anyone who's not ready for that, that's not what this video is. Instead, I want to spend a bit of time discussing one of the aspects of the film that I found to be the most impressive: how it functions as a prequel. Prequels tend to be a hard sell, and I can understand that. Over the last couple of decades, they have a consistent track record of being, at best, disappointing, and at worst, ruining areas of the story that inspired them. And as much as I'm an advocate for giving things a chance, and am fascinated by seeing how an adaptation or new point of view changes the story, I tend to join the collective eye roll whenever a prequel is announced. But Wonka is part of a specific trend of prequels that debatably began with Maleficent seeing the origins of iconic film characters. Another trend that I haven't really cared for. More often than not, they tend to struggle when compared to the stories that originated them. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is one of those everyone's seen it movies, so I was fully ready for Wonka to buckle under the pressure and repeat the mistakes of its fellow prequels. But I can safely say that that is not the case. Wonka avoids the traps prequels tend to fall into as smoothly as fresh melted ganache, and I want to go over how I think it does this. So let's do a deep look and take a close dive. Nope, scratch that. Reverse it. When it comes to Wonka's approach as a prequel, there are two areas I want to focus on: the references to the source material and the main character's journey. Let's start with the references. Now, when I say source material, I'm mainly talking about the 1971 film starring Gene Wilder. Not only is it a whole other legal battle to reference much of anything from the book or other adaptations, but I mean, come on, look at him. I think we all know which version Warner Bros. Wanted you to think of when this was promoted. Keeping that in mind, they are incredibly restrained here. One of the things that's so frustrating about prequels to me is that it feels like certain characters, plot points, or even just symbols and names are in these movies because they have to be. Puzzle pieces that are smashed into a story that they really don't fit into, but we need them in there because this story is meant to be a build-up to the story this is branching off from. More often than not, they work against the story rather than alongside it like they logically should. As such, not only do these moments come off as distracting, but they distort the view of the thing it's in reference to. This is a big issue people had with Lion King 1.5. And yeah, I know that's not a traditional prequel, but just let me elaborate. If you take it as canon, then a lot of the grand, iconic moments in the original movie get recontextualized as antics with Timon and Pumbaa and lose some of their grandness. This isn't always done clumsily. In fact, I think Lion King 1.5 is a good example of both good and bad prequel references, but I've seen it done poorly more often than not. Wonka, however, keeps its callbacks few and far between. Willy is still a chocolate maker, just a young aspiring one who dreams of sharing his unique creations with the world, but past that, the movie focuses on telling its own story first and foremost, and having fun with the creativity its premise offers them. Focusing on the chocolate making, there is not a single chocolate in this movie that is from the 1971 film. They are all original creations. That alone was impressive. I was waiting for a moment of seeing an everlasting gobstopper in the prototype phase, or Willy joking about the churning power of waterfalls. But that doesn't happen. Willy Wonka's chocolatier knowledge is so expansive that they don't need to repeat ideas, or make the ideas in the first movie seem bigger and more important than they are. Obviously, there are references and callbacks to the original film, but they don't linger on them. They make you perk up if you notice them, but they're not going to stop the story dead in its tracks, so you will notice them. You gotta spot them yourself, and when you do, it can be pretty charming.
So shines a good deed
in a weary world.
I think this scene near the end of the opening number demonstrates how Wonka still acts as a prequel, but avoids the traps of its kin. Willy is stopped by a woman asking for a donation to help her and her child, which Willy, despite having 3 sovereigns to his name, happily obliges. Now, in a lesser prequel, I'd imagine her saying something like, "Come along, Charlie," to her child, maybe even with Willy turning and staring at them for a moment, but not entirely sure why, making it a weird, fateful encounter. However, moments later, Willy loses his his last sovereign in a sewer grate, a much more subtle connection that people actually pointed out to me, because Charlie found a sovereign in a grate in the original film, and that was the money he used to buy the chocolate bar that had that sought-after golden ticket. There's none of those unnecessary connections that drive me crazy in prequels here. There are callbacks and moments that echo ones from the original, but not in a way where it all feels like a predetermined path. A lot happens in people's lives, and that should be the same for characters too. Wonka does an impressively good job at having his chocolate cake and eating it too. The only thing that feels kind of out of place is the fact that there is an Oompa Loompa here at all. I don't think they couldn't have one in here, but as fun as Lofty is, he feels weirdly out of place in the story for such an iconic part of the Wonka world. But, you know, Lofty's role and Hugh Grant's attitude towards the part is a subject best saved for another video, perhaps. The biggest part of this movie that feels like a traditional prequel callback, though, was the golden paper wrapped around the chocolate bar that Willie's mother left him. And you know what? At that point, they earned it. It helps that this is the culmination of the emotional core of this movie, too. If you are somehow not familiar with the 1971 film, it is just a lovely message to Willie from his mom. If you are familiar with the original, it adds a much more powerful context to that iconic piece of the film, which is in essence what prequels are supposed to do. The other prequel hurdle Wonka manages to overcome is how it depicts its title character. Another common trap this specific genre falls into is the complications with depicting the character they chose and navigating the dangers of lifting the veil, so to speak. While a character can be fascinating enough to speculate about their history outside of the narrative they originate from, some of that intrigue can very well come from not getting the answers. It can be demystifying to learn too much about something or someone mysterious. It's a common mistake that happens with characters like the Borg or the Weeping Angels. Over-explaining and overusing something can take away what made it so cool in the first place. Willy Wonka is definitely the kind of character where if you try to explain him a bit too much, it's gonna take away some of the fun. But Wonka walks that tightrope very well, which is impressive because they do fall into some of the familiar tropes of these kinds of stories. There is a sequence going into where Willie comes from, why he loves chocolate so much, even explaining how he can do some more elaborate tricks when he mentions he wanted to be a magician. But for me, it never quite got to the level of over-explaining. Willie's outlandish and optimistic nature is just enough to make him feel off-kilter and mysterious, and let's be honest, even if a lot of his tricks are just close-up magic, I think some of these stunts would give Penn and Teller a run for their money. I think the trick here is that there's no sequence of progression building these traits up. We don't need to see him become this quirky person that everyone is perplexed by. He just is. And that's great! They're able to strike that balance of telling a humanizing story without bringing Wonka down to earth. But then there's the other challenge of crafting an origin story for a well-known character, giving them an arc when there's already a predetermined ending. The main criticism I hear about Willy Wonka in this movie is that he's too nice, which, I mean, he is. This does not seem like the same guy who ironically punishes children for, at most, bad habits. But here's the thing, that's the point. If people went into this movie expecting to see the lavish recluse in front of a rainbow-colored backdrop with a dark cloud of cynicism hanging overhead, I can see some being disappointed, but I also think they went in with the wrong idea. I was relieved they didn't go in that direction. In this movie, Willy Wonka is just as quirky and theatrical as his future counterpart, but he's also optimistic and naive. And I love that. Most of the traits of Gene Wilder's version are in this version played by Timothée Chalamet, but they aren't weathered down with age and experience. He's an ambitious and bright-eyed young man, confronted for the first time by the harsh realities of pursuing what he wants to do with his life. And honestly, what young adult can't relate to that? The story of Wonka depicts certain traits of Willy Wonka, where they originate from, and the arc of the movie is him becoming more mature and capable. Again, Wonka's character development in this movie is something that I could go on for a while about, but I'm going to try my best to keep my points brief. This is taking a lot of restraint, but I promised myself these discussion videos would be shorter. For starters, that two-faced nature is still kind of there. It's very infrequent and it happens in ways that I don't even think he's entirely aware of, but young Willy Wonka definitely does some questionable stuff. One minute he's lecturing a young girl not to steal milk off a stoop, and then that night he's intoxicating a guard so he can break into a zoo.
Let's go.
But as the movie goes on, he becomes craftier out of necessity. The same skills he was using to find rare ingredients for his chocolate and pull stuff out of his Mary Poppins style hat are later used to pick a lock on a third-story cell or break into the lair of the chocolate cartel. Yes, if you haven't seen this movie, there is a chocolate cartel. It is as ridiculous as it sounds, and that's why it's so great. He's not incapable of being cunning or morally questionable, he's just polite when he does it. Until they get their revenge on the cartel. That's where I think the transformation into older Wonka began.
Don't worry, gentlemen, you'll come down eventually. Probably. I think.
Wonka doesn't do the more dubious things he does in the 71 film because up to this point, he's gotten by just fine on good-natured enthusiasm. But once circumstances force him to fight back, he pulls out every trick up his sleeve and throws them at anyone who dare be harmful or greedy, which is something that Wonka enhances about the character that I never gave much thought before, his practices as a businessman. Everyone pokes fun about how the factory isn't safe, he violates every health code imaginable making this stuff, and whatever the working conditions are for the Oompa Loompas. But what's given less focus is how accessible Wonka makes his chocolate. In the original film, Wonka makes the most desired and high-quality chocolate in the world, but you can still get the most popular items for a mere sovereign, and that's an attitude he's had since day one, apparently. Which absolutely disgusts his competition, who sells much lower quality chocolate at 10 times the price. Because that's what every greedy corporation does. Whether it's because Wonka was a poor kid himself, or because he's seen how much chocolate can uplift someone who's dealing with complicated situations and strife, he wants to operate in a way where everyone can try some of his chocolate. Because everyone deserves something sweet in their life. As much as he wants to make money, because that's the measure of success, he doesn't put his creations behind a high paywall when he very easily could. And seeing him exude those virtues in this movie only amplified something that was almost hidden to me in the original. What starts as natural instinct becomes a full-on mission. Which brings me to the final thing that makes this prequel version of Willy Wonka so well portrayed. By the end of the film, he's still not the Willy Wonka we know. There's a natural desire that when you tell a prequel story, you need to get to that familiar, iconic end goal. While it can be satisfying to get to that point, in my opinion, it can also be limiting, especially if handled poorly. However, Wonka doesn't end with Willy Wonka as the biggest name in chocolate making. He's only recruited one Oompa Loompa for crying out loud. There are bigger aspirations from where the movie began, certainly, where they basically lose all self-control in those callbacks, but hey, might as well go out with a bang. But he's still building things up. Wonka doesn't end with Willy as a recluse lost in his success. He still has some of that light in his eyes, that ear-to-ear grin, that natural way of running around excitedly like a kid in a self-made candy store at whatever he can create next. And personally, I think that's more than okay. According to director Paul King, Wonka is set 25 years before the 1971 film. Most high-profile prequels either take place right before the main event it's a prequel to, or assume things went by pretty uneventfully until the original story happened. But a lot happens in people's lives. Think of your own life in the last 5 years, let alone 25. There are some people watching this video who haven't even been alive that long. That's one of Wonka's greatest successes in my eyes. This is not the end of Willy Wonka's story. It's just the beginning. The story of where the journey of this unconventional, manic, yet charismatic chocolatier began, how he grew into the person who would go on to dominate his field, what changed, what stayed the same, and what might have been lost by the time he grew into Gene Wilder, and wouldn't be reignited until he found someone who could light that spark again and keep what he'll build alive. Wonka was fighting a losing battle from the start. Developing a prequel has got to be one of the most thankless tasks in Hollywood. A lot is at stake when you try to add a new chapter to a story people feel they know so well. People have their doubts about this. I was one of them, but Wonka still has the quirky story beats, sweet childlike spirit, and wish fulfillment that still feels earned that made Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory so beloved for generations. While I doubt Wonka will have the same kind of staying power, I can at least say for these reasons and more, it can stand proudly alongside it. You've never had a prequel quite like this.
Is it as good as you remember?
Every little bit.
Thanks for watching, everyone. Definitely let me know what you thought of Wonka in the comments below. That's why the series is called Let's Talk About. And as a bonus, let me know what your favorite prequel is. This is a topic that often gets pretty bashed on, so I want to know what you guys consider some of the best. I want to give a very special thanks to my patrons who help support my content. including Chelsea Crandall, David L. Sproul, Jinx Productions, and Wait in the Wings. If you'd like to join these fine people in supporting my content while getting cool exclusive perks, you can check my Patreon page at the link in the description, as well as my other social media if you'd like to check out any of those. Thank you so much again for watching, and I will see you guys next time.